Hey, this is my ADC tier list for patch 25.4. Before I dive into the tier list, I want to give a little bit of an introduction about myself. So I'm a former pro player. I've played in OCE for 5 years. I've been challenger since 2016. I've also played on the EUS server, got challenger there, and also achieved grandmaster on the Korean server. Currently, what I'm doing now is private coaching, and I'm also pursuing content creation. So I've got a lot more content on the way with this sort of stuff, with tier lists, team fight breakdowns in pro play, and other educational content. So lots to get excited about. Now, back onto the tier list. I've got 6 tiers to kind of categorize every single champion. I've got S blind, S counter, A, B, C, and D. And starting off with the D tier, these are the champions I consider just total garbage champions. You should avoid picking them in solo queue at all costs. They're not on your mind until, Riot kind of gives them a little bit more love, buffs them a little bit. Starting off in the D tier, we have Nilah. So sort of been forgotten by Riot. I think she has niche spots where she can thrive in, specifically with enchanter supports like Senna, like Yuumi. However, I think she requires too much coordination to pull off in solo queue, and I think the solo queue environment's not indicative of like what Nilah wants. Your average solo queue support is not aware of how Nilah operates, and I think she's like a duo queue only champion. But I think she's just super weak in the power, right? In terms of like just champion power. So I say don't pick Nilah. Don't even consider learning her. Second champ in D tier, we have Samira. So she's been out of meta for a very long time, and I think for good reason, right? Because if you think about how Samira wants to operate, Samira wants to generate a lead from laning phase and then snowball that into team fights and objectives and stuff. But currently, her champion matchups in the laning phase are just really rough. She struggles to kind of look for any openings or fights in the early game. I think also just the general field of champions that you're up against, such as like bruisers, such as tanks, those sort of champions Samira struggles against. So she's just not going to have a good time out of lane either. Now moving on to the C tier, these are the champs I do not recommend blind picking in solo queue. They might have a spot in certain games if you get a good counter pick here and there, but I think most of these champs are probably just picked by one tricks. Starting off, we have Kalista. Kalista has had her early game numbers hit by Riot repeatedly, so it's kind of made her solo queue performance decrease a lot. I think probably just avoid picking Kalista unless you're very confident in your ability or your one trick. Moving on to Xayah. Similarly, she's had her AP numbers reduced quite a bit, and I think currently she doesn't have a very clear or great item build, and she's a champ who's very reliant on hitting her item spikes and getting her evolves. So if she doesn't have a great item build, Xayah's never going to be in a good spot. Next up, we have Draven. Draven is in a similar boat to Kalista in the fact that he's, a champ who relies on early game snowball to push the game and kind of accelerate the game, right? However, I think Draven struggles a lot more versus the higher tier champions in the tier list in terms of the laning phase. He still has the ability to, take over games with his passive, right? But I also think considering the general field of champs you're versing as Draven in your solo queue games, like assassins, like juggernauts, like tanks, you're probably going to have a bad time. Next up, Lucian. Lucian also doesn't have a great build similar to Xayah. He's very tied to the enchanters enabling him, such as Nami, such as Milio, right? So I would say don't even consider picking him unless your support's willing to go that route. Next up, we have Sivir. She doesn't really fit the theme of solo queue where it's super chaotic. There's a lot of fighting. Sivir kind of just wants a calm game, and she wants to scale to 3 items, right? The second last pick we have in C tier is Vayne. The Vayne, she does have some spots where she can pop off, if there's a lot of tanks and she doesn't have a bad laning matchup. But I think in general, she has very clear weaknesses, right? She doesn't have a lot of wave clear. All she really offers is damage to a team comp. So the team comp needs to revolve around Vayne for it to be effective. And that's why I think she's just gonna struggle. If you fall behind on Vayne, you're basically just a dead weight to your team. And lastly, on C tier, we have Yasuo. Yasuo has had a few indirect and direct buffs to him, like with the IE buff and the crit damage scaling on his passive. However, I think in solo queue, it's very difficult to find an avenue to pick Yasuo because when you're picking Yasuo and you're removing a marksman from your team comp, you're losing that consistent DPS. And that's important around neutrals in the mid-late game, right? So I would say don't even consider picking Yasuo unless you have some sort of consistent damage on your team. But then you also need the conditions that, you know, your teammates know how to play with Yasuo, you have knockups for Yasuo, and the laning phase is not going to be too hard. Onto the B tier. These champions, I consider the champ power level quite high actually, but you've got to pick them in the right spots. So first of all, starting off, we have Aphelios. Aphelios, he's had quite a few indirect buffs with the crit item changes, with Yuntal, with IE, and Last Whisper. He loves all of those items. That's his core build. And I think he has some decent matchups, especially versus the champions in the lower tiers. However, he definitely has clear weaknesses, right? His weakness is range, his weakness is super hard engage. Now, Jhin, overall, not great, but not bad. I think in solo queue, he thrives a lot with just the ability to, you know, push and then also be able to assist in skirmishes through long range. However, I think people also haven't discovered what Jin's best build is. Moving on, we have Twitch, who recently has had quite a resurgence through small buffs to his abilities, but mainly it's the Axiom Arcanist rune that he's taking out, buffing his ultimate damage. I think if you can get Twitch in a good spot where you don't have, you know, a hard lane, and you also ideally paired with an enchanter to enable him, then I think Twitch can actually take over some games. Moving on, we have Xayah. Xayah, similar to Aphelios, you want, you know, ideally the enemy champions coming into you and you being able to kite and use your feathers with your pullback. One thing that Xayah does have, which Aphelios does not, is obviously her pairing with Rakan. So if you're duo queue, you can pull off that combo, and it's something that can be very oppressive in solo queue, and can kind of take over the game. Sorry. The last champion I have in B tier is Zeri. You want to pick her with an enchanter. She's not as strong as she once was, but getting to 2-3 items, you still become a teamfight monster. Now going into the A tier, these are the champs that I think you can blind pick in solo queue and find success in most games. Starting off, we've got Ashe. Ashe has been in a very good spot since the start of the season. I think now with her Yuntal build, which I think is the best, she excels in solo queue. She's pickable with almost any support in the game. And I think she's just a good all-round champ. Second up, we have Caitlyn. I think Caitlyn's still very good after all the nerfs that have happened. She's benefited a lot from the crit item changes, specifically Yuntal, IE, and the Last Whisper changes. No slouch, and she definitely still has the potential to take over games with, you know, her tower pushing capabilities. Next, we have Ezreal. So I think Ezreal, still a very potent champ. I think he's in a very good spot right now. At 2-3 items is when he comes online and starts to take over the game. I think that is around when the game starts to, you know, revolve around who's stronger in the 5v5. I think there's a good argument that Ezreal is a very good choice around that point of the game, where there's the soul point or Baron is spawned. And fourth, we have Misfortune. I think Misfortune is in a very good spot right now. She's got two builds that she can go. She can go lethality, or she can go BT into crit. I think one major underrated thing to do with MF is her strut move speed, allowing her to get through any sort of lane, specifically with the home guard buff now starting at 1 minute rather than at 14. It allows her to get back to lane faster than any other champ in the game and kind of just spam eco recalls and get out of any trouble. And the last champ we have on A tier is Tristana. Tristana's power right now is kind of overlooked ever since her little mini rework at the end of last season, trying to push away from mid lane back into bot. However, I still think she's good in both roles. She has a lot of decent matchups, especially against the champions in the lower tier, but I think her power right now, she just does so much damage in the bot lane, especially paired with an engaged support. You can find a lot of success. Up at the S counter tier now, these champions, if you pick them in the right conditions, you pick them in a good matchup, can be completely game winning. So the first champion we have in the S counter tier is Kog'Maw. And I want to specifically say Kog'Maw with an enchanter, because I think it's completely unplayable without him. So I think the comps you want to look for to fit Kog'Maw into are those Death Ball 5v5 team comps where you've got a frontline and you've got an enchanter supporting you and enabling you. I think at 1 to 2 items, especially with the Guinsoo's first build, which I think is the most effective build, he spikes really hard, and then later into the game you can pivot into more like tanky items and become a frontliner basically. I also believe the field of champions you're versing right now in solo queue, like including bruisers, including juggernauts and tanks, Kog'Maw deals very well with them. And the second champ we have in the S counter tier is another very late game scaling champion, Smolder. I think Smolder's weakness previously was his early game. I think that's drastically improved ever since the mini rework that happened last year. I think he's been overlooked a little bit. He's still the same monster at 225 and at 3 items. I think his build has just changed a little bit, and people haven't gotten used to the changes. Now we're in the final tier, the S blind tier. I think these champs you can blind pick in solo queue every single game. I think these champs are the best champs for climbing. First off, we have Corki. I think Corki's definitely very overtuned right now. I think his damage is super insane, especially from 1 to 3 items. He doesn't really have any power troughs. I think he has no clear weaknesses or any bad matchups really. And he also fits very well into any sort of team comp. Next up, we have Jinx. Jinx is probably the biggest beneficiary of all the crit item buffs. I think she loves the fact that IE has been reduced by 150 gold, which is a huge spike for her. And she also thrives in the kind of solo queue environment where there's a lot of fighting. And if we think about how Jinx wants to team fight, she wants to play for a passive proc. And I think when there's a lot more opportunities for that, she tends to do better. And next up on the S-Blind tier list, we have Varus. I think it might be a bit surprising seeing him this high up on the list. However, I think the versatility of his builds is kind of what makes him so good. The fact that you can pick him with almost any support and any team comp really. You just have to adjust what build and runes you're going. Currently, we have the lethality build and the on-hit build with either Bork Guinsoo or Guinsoo first. And the third build, which is AP, a little bit more unexplored, but I think it deals very well with the current field of champions where it's very bruiser heavy, a lot of HP stackers who don't build too many resists. AP Varus tends to deal very well with them. And now the last champion that we have in the S-Blind tier list is Ziggs. So he's still the premier mage in bot lane, has a very easy laning phase against all of these 80 carries, and I think he fits very well into any team comp in solo queue. So you can fit him into a poke team comp, you can fit him into a 1-3-1 team comp, one that dives. Ziggs does it all. And I think on top of that, Ziggs offers the tower killing potential and the ability to snowball the game off of that. The only criticism for Ziggs is that he's maybe not the best champ at completely 1v9ing. If you have a gold lead on him, you kind of need your teammates to set you up a little bit, but he's very consistent every time you pick him. Now this is what the final ADC tier list looks like for patch 25.4. Let me know in the comments what you think about this, or if I left out anything